Do you ever meet someone who has so many good stories that you could listen to them for hours? Well, that's the problem we ran into with Mike Vander Sleesen. Although I really wouldn't call it a problem dedicating 2 episodes to a guy who lived through what you could call the golden age of European motorcycling. So that's exactly what we're doing. You see, before he started Vanson Leathers, Mike lived in Europe in the 60s, specifically in Holland and then in France, before moving back to the United States. Between riding some of the coolest motorcycles ever made, taking full advantage of no speed limits on the highways, and camping on the side of the road, Mike experienced a time in motorcycling that most of us only got to see in movies, while riding on bikes that some of us would be lucky to see just once in our lifetime. But hey, if you live on the East Coast, you may just see Mike out riding on a piece of history still. He's got a Norton Commando, or 2, from his days across the pond, and they still run. At least when they want to. This is Mike Vander Sleesen. Again, I'm your host, Mark Long, and you're listening to Driven to Ride. All right, Mike Vander Sleesen, you are back onto Driven to Ride. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, you are such a mainstay and a character in the motorcycle industry. We had to have you back on for a second round. So,
well, perception is reality, right?
Well, yeah, I guess you could say that. So, but like we talked about in the first episode, you've had a little, motorcycle and leather apparel business that's done okay over the last, half century.
Yeah, Vanson.
Yeah, if we could start there, let me know what are you known for? What's your claim to fame, as it were?
Well, we make leather jackets and racing gear, racing suits, and all that kind of stuff here in the United States, and we've been doing it for 50 years. Started in 74, so this is 24, and that's 50. So, been doing it for a while.
Yeah,
and that's the deal.
Well, congratulations on 50 years officially.
Thank you.
And yeah, but you've been riding motorcycles a lot longer than that. We touched on it again in part 1. And if you haven't listened to that one, I'd highly suggest going back and listening. But you started riding in Europe, I believe, correct?
I did. I started in Europe. My father was Dutch, and we lived in Holland. And my aunt had a Solex, and they lived on an estate in a carriage house because the Second World War had resulted in a lot of housing being bombed out.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a shortage of housing. And so they had a place on an estate that had been expropriated. It was a Jewish family that lost everything. But anyway, on this estate were a lot of paths through the woods and a greenhouse and all that type of thing. And so that's where I got the first chance to ride a motorized bicycle, which is what a Solex was. It had a motor on the front wheel, and it was kind of cool. You could zip around, and I was about 9, and when that started, and it was a lot more interesting than pedaling everywhere, So.
Yeah, probably get you not too terribly much faster, but maybe a little bit faster.
Well, you can get going pretty well, but it was a pedal bike with an assist. Let's put it that way.
Sure. Were those pretty popular back in the day?
Yeah, sure. Solexes were all over the place. In Europe after the Second World War, in the early 60s, it wasn't anything as affluent as it is now. Most people commuted on bicycles, and then there were these motor-assisted bicycles to get around. Cars were not very common. They were there. There were plenty of them, you would think, but it wasn't anything like it is today. And a lot of people didn't have cars in their household at all.
Mm-hmm.
And everything was unimaginable. I mean, if you wanted to get a telephone, it usually took 6 months or 7 months to get a phone number and get a line installed in your house. And of course, you couldn't dial cross borders. You couldn't dial the way we do today. I mean, everything was really reduced and restricted. If you wanted to make a call to the United States from Holland in 1962 and 3 and so on, you made an appointment with the international operator, and she would get the other party on the line, and then you had better be available at the time that you made the appointment, and then you would have a connection.
Wow.
But it was completely different than anything you can imagine today. And so the motorbike scene and the car scene and was that everything was utilitarian. There really wasn't. There was racing and so on, but it was really, for the most part, it was street bikes being raced, not race bikes being raced. So whole different world.
Sounds like you just kind of had to work with what you had and be happy about it.
Yeah, well, I mean that's exactly right.
So when you started riding that Solex, did you kind of know that you were hooked on riding on two wheels from that point, especially with a motor?
Yeah, it was definitely, yeah, the way to go. Yeah.
What was about it? Was it the speed? Was it the freedom to kind of go farther? What did it for you?
Yeah, I mean the fact you could go someplace, and I mean in those days, and continuing today. I mean Holland relatively flat, so a lot of
Mhm.
bicycles, but there's also they have bike paths everywhere. Um, and really, the bike paths are like a highway network, uh, so you can really do distances town to town, that type of thing. Um, and on the bike paths, you were allowed to have mopeds, so bikes under 50 cc, 49 cc. So the Solex was the slowest, least capable machine for that kind of thing. And then up from there, you ended up with bikes that actually had like gearboxes and 2 speed, and then 3 speed, then 4 speed, that kind of thing. Mostly all hand shift,
Mhm.
but and to start it, you'd pedal it and get it going that way. They were mostly all 2-stroke. They were all 2-stroke at that time. Um, and so yeah, it was just a whole different world. But people did um, put their stuff on a bike and get on the bike path and go 20, 25 miles from town to town as needed. Of course, today it's mostly all automobile, but that was then.
Yeah.
So yes, it was a really, and you didn't have I think it was 16 was the age limit, but no one was really paying attention to that. You just get on there and go.
Yeah. You could just go wherever you wanted and nobody really bothered to check, which is wild by today's standards. But when you
Yeah.
think about post-war Europe, it makes a little bit more sense. So,
Hmm.
so you were on the Solex for a while. When did you end up getting a dyed in the wool full on motorcycle?
Well, it was a progression. I mean,
Hmm.
first there was a Solex, and then I had a 2-speed Puch, Puch, Austrian bike. And then after that, I had a 4-speed Puch, hand shift, and then I had a Garelli, which was 6.5 horsepower with a 18 millimeter Del Orto carburetor on it, and we took the pedals off, because you didn't want to be confused, and and you could it had a look to it that was really motorbike. Um,
Hmm.
and that meant that it had big fin cylinder, even though a small bore, but so you could masquerade on the highways. And if you got in like right behind a truck or something, they'd be whistling along at 120 kilometers an hour, and you could be right behind them in the draft, and and but so it was a whole different world. And and then after that, I had a Vespa, 175, and then after that, I ended up with BSA,
Okay.
and then after that, a series of Nortons, which I still have.
Yeah, yeah. I remember you still have a Norton 750 or 850.
I've got a 750, which is now a 900. It's got a stroker crank in it, um, and I bought that in '72. And I've got 3, 4, 74 Norton 850.
Wow. So, and you've had that one since 72. So you've had that motorcycle longer than you've been running Vanson Leathers.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, yeah.
And when you came back to the United States, did you bring that one back from Europe? Is that a Europe original?
I did, yeah.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's been running this whole time?
Well, it's a Norton, so
When it wants to.
yeah.
So you said 5 Nortons. What fascinates you about the Nortons?
Well, I think they're beautifully made. It's that, and then the design is terrific. Um, One of my really good friends, it turns out, was a designer for Norton's, and Mick Ofield, and he actually did a lot of design and catalog work for Vanson in the '90s, and really from I don't know '91 to or '90 to 2005. He's retired now and moved to Tennessee,
Mm-hmm.
but he was the guy who laid out the red, white, and blue John Player Nortons, and working at Norton in England. He's English, and so yeah, no, they're beautiful machines, and there's a personal connection there. I mean, went to the factory and when it was operating and so on. So it was a whole different thing.
Oh, okay. What brought you to the BSA? I'm sorry, the Norton factory.
I've been to the BSA factory too, as well. I had a BSA Lightning that threw the left connecting rod, and we ended up taking the disassembled motor to Birmingham and ended up at the BSA Research Center there, which was kind of an anomaly. And first, first we ended up, it was on Armory Road. I'll never forget it. And the front of the building sort of was a 1959 modern British look, so it had sort of ceramic panels and they were greenish and aluminum window frames. And, but behind the facade was this Victorian thing with a leaky roof. And we ended up going down past the assembly shed, and in the back core, there was BSA House, which looked kind of like a Victorian mansion, and they had a Rolls Royce out in front, said BSA One on it, and all that. So we ended up in there, and it was cut crystal chandeliers, and everything was filthy. Nothing had been cleaned in 700 years, and the Oriental carpets were worn out, threadbare. Anyway, we were directed. My part must have. I was with Jamie Goodson, my partner, with whom I started Vanson, and then we ended up going to the research department, and there was a guy there, the white coat, Davies was his name. I'll never forget it. Cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and a linoleum counter, put the box exploded motor on there. And he's like, well, we've never seen this before, So, okay. So he gets a BSA factory box out and puts our serial number on it and everything else, and puts all the parts in it and says, we're going to analyze this. And then opens the door behind him. And it's a room of metal racking, kind of like Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. There were, I don't know, thousands of blown up motors in there.
Yeah. Wow.
So we came back after lunch, as he advised, and there was a new motor with our serial number punched on it. And that was their answer to the problem.
Wow. That's funny. It's kind of like technology now, where it's like if your smartphone doesn't work or some kind of technology doesn't work, well, we can't really repair it. We'll just replace it and call it a day, and then figure out what went wrong after the fact.
Yeah, or even better, it's turn it off and turn it on.
Yeah, give it another shot. So did your visit to the Norton factory, was that also due to an engine blow up, or was that just for sightseeing? Or
no, I no, it was everything was a human scale. I mean, it was
Sure.
And it was England, and and I was working in a dealership in France, and so we'd go to England because that was the center. That's where everything happened. That's where all everything that was new was developed there. This is pre CB 754 and all that. But yes, and it was we went there and Andover Norton's. I just went there, and there was sitting in the. We had an issue with the auto advance unit; it wasn't working properly, and anyway, they had a manufacturing issue with those, so
Hmm.
they were changing them out and looking at them, and I happened to be there with my bike, and I was sitting in the little foyer there, and the Norton security guard, he's getting on the phone with the local police and saying, we're looking for a 20,000 pound check. It seems to have gone missing. It might have been dropped out of someone's pocket. If
Yikes.
has it been reported? You know, and in the meanwhile, the guy with the electric cart showed up and brought the pints of milk and put them in the door, right inside
Hmm.
the door. And this is a reasonably new building. And so then one by one, the secretaries came down to get their pint of milk out of the case. There were like 12 of them, and 12 women came down over the next, I had 25 minutes, and each one picked up a pint and went back up the stairs. So, so it was, and there was a great guy there. His name was Ernie Winters. He was the Norton technician. And, um, and, and he was, you do 3 half turns on the air screw on the carburetor. That's what you do on all of them. There's no other adjustment to be made. Okay. So,
Wow, that must have been cool though to meet the people that were actually working on these classic motorcycles. In hindsight, now it's like you met the people that were actually working on these things and developing them, and that turned into such legendary motorcycles. 50, 60 years later.
yeah. Well, they had moved. They had moved some equipment from time to time when they shifted
Hmm.
production around, because they actually brought the Norton production into Wolverhampton, which was the old Villiers factory. Um, but they were having trouble with the with valve guides. And Mick told me this story, and I might have it kind of like a little off, but they couldn't figure out why the valve guides weren't going in to the heads just right, and they had the same jig and the same lathe and tool and all of that. And so they went back to the old guy at the other factory and said, "Hey, why are we having this trouble?" And he said, "Well, did you take the plank? Plank? What plank? Well, the plank that you need to shim up the machine jig."
Oh, geez.
So it was, a little variable here and there.
Slight variables, yeah.
Mm.
But that's kind of seems like the whole motorcycle scene and motorcycle industry, even to a degree, was kind of this tinkering, customizing, getting as much horsepower or getting that little bit of an edge, an extra couple miles or kilometers per hour out of a motorcycle that you could. But it was all on you too, for the most part, right?
Yeah, it was. In a lot of it was getting a bike and making it yours,
Hmm.
and and of course here in the States it was big into the chopper, change the frame and do all that. But over there it was focused on street riding and to the faster. And so like guys here would build a chopper and not have a front brake, and over there, the deal was let's get a bigger brake that works better. And so there, I mean, you had the 2 leading shoe, the 4 leading shoe, the 8 leading shoes,
Wow,
for
yeah.
drum brakes, and they and everything was mechanical, so it all needed to be adjusted. I mean, disc brakes were really something around. Well, Honda had the first one on a production bike, as I know that I can think of, in '69. Um, Everybody else was playing catch up from then on.
Mhm.
I was on the CB 750, but the whole focus, rear sets. I mean, it was all Dunstall, Tickle Engineering. These were performance people.
Yeah, and I mean the size and scope. You mentioned that it was kind of a human scale where if you're in France, for example, it's not a difficult journey to get to England or any other country. And the streets, the cities are a little bit denser, so you probably have to stop just as fast, if not faster, because you're tearing through a city street rather than on a big American highway.
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, at that time, most of the highways didn't have speed limits,
Really?
so that was a whole different thing. But if you went to you had to take a ferry. England's an island, right? So
Right.
and so you'd get on the boat, and there was always cluster of continental people on the ferries going to England, with their bikes.
Hmm.
And they'd all descend on some of the dealers in London. I mean, the Comerfords, Pride and Clark, and Lewis Leathers at the time, and so on. So, I mean, that's what people did. Um, and England was a developed motorcycle culture. They had Motorcycle News, MCN, uh, published weekly, and and everything was there. I mean, whether it was the fashion at Carnaby Street and Kings Road with the pirate radio stations, Radio Caroline, Radio London, Radio England, blah blah blah. It was just a really uh, vibrant, uh, free kind of thing. Um, and the on the continent, things were much more. They're tighter. They're more regulated. They didn't really have the fashion and so on. Uh,
Wasn't as kind of forward and progressive or
well, yeah, I mean, Mick Jagger didn't go to Paris to get his suit. So
Sure, sure. Well, let's go back to those no speed limits. So that was in England, that was on the continent, or that was everywhere on the highways.
that was really on the continent. England
Okay.
had speed limits,
Hmm.
but on the continent, on the main highways, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, uh, no limits on the speed.
Wow. So were there police like on the highways, or were they just in the cities? Or, did you get a speeding ticket ever? Or
No, I mean, will driving dangerously, you would get it. You could get apprehended and so on. But you know the, I mean, I pulled into, you have these roadsides the way you have here, service plaza. On like some of the main roads. Well, in France, you pull into a service plaza, and they have, at that time they had their equivalent to like French fast food, whatever that was. So, but you could buy your half bottle of wine to have with your sandwich or whatever, and then you get back in your car and get back on the highway. Okay,
Sure.
so
Yeah.
so 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 that's a cultural difference that it doesn't happen that way anymore because they've become more draconian than anyone, uh, with with the results of the carnage. But it was all it was, and in France you had a whole ton of these. France and Belgium, you've had with these what they call the national roads, so they're one one level down from the highways.
Hmm.
A lot of them, a lot of them were 3 lanes, so the middle lane was for passing both directions.
Oh, yikes.
So they're and high speed. So um, and of course the French, they had a lot of ground fog in northern France, so the code was for yellow headlights, so to cut the fog, so you could see through the fog. So you could always tell a French car that had yellow headlights. And it was, when you the English were coming over and going around in their cars in the '60s and so on, before they had the foreign exchange crises, and they were not really allowed to leave with more than a few pounds in their pockets. So this is when they still had a world dominating currency. Well, anyway, a player in that field. But you used to see the English pulled over at 10 o'clock. I never could figure out, driving through Switzerland and so on. God, all these cars are on the side of the road about 10 o'clock or 10:30 in the morning. And then it's like, gee, they all got GB on the back of the back of the car, and
Right.
then it dawned on me, oh, they're all having tea.
Oh, yeah. I never would have thought of that either. Tea time waits for no one, I guess.
Tea time waits for no one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you did a lot of traveling. Is that all over the continent? Did you do that by motorcycle? Like take a lot of motorcycle trips all across Europe?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A lot of camping.
What was your first big trip that you did around Europe?
Well, we used to go to England all the time, which which
Hmm.
which was 60 miles or 80 miles to the ferry, and then pop over to Dover or Folkestone, and then another 30, 40 miles, you'd be in the London area, and I had friends I could stay with, so that's what I did frequently. I got my first driving license in England.
Oh, wow.
Uh, but the camping, the first big trip I did was I went to Venice from Brussels on my Garelli 50cc, and
Wow.
gone a couple of weeks, I think 3 weeks, 2.5 or 3 weeks, and it was camping all the way every night. And I had a little stove, and you know, put my tent up and go right through, and went through the Alps, and um, yeah, so that was great.
Yeah. Yeah. How did the little Garelli do over the Alps?
First gear, no problem. Coming down, we were pretty fast.
And then it's different now, obviously, but back in the day, you could kind of camp anywhere where you could just kind of pull over and find a spot, right?
Yes, and we did. I mean, it was both. I mean, if you wanted a shower and all that, you got a camping ground, um, but if you were just buzzing around, I mean, you could just roll out and catch a little shut eye, no problem.
Mm. Is that the farthest you went on in kind of your European travels, or did you head anywhere else that was noteworthy?
Well, all through France, and that was the longest single trip that I made on that bike.
Hmm.
I did other trips like that when I had the Norton. You could go far faster, as they used to say in their advertising.
Right, right. Well, one of the things about they always say about in Europe 100 years. I'm sorry, in America 100 years is a long time, and in Europe 100 miles is a long distance. And so it seems like if you kind of had some experience in America and then moved to Europe, the 100 miles probably didn't seem all that long to you. So you probably were able to travel, as far as you wanted to go, really, especially on the Norton.
Yeah, yeah. I wish it's the distances are different, but yes. Um, and I mean, part of the deal though is to enjoy what you're driving through, and so the little roads, the national roads, through the little towns and villages, and that's really where you get most of the interest. You're just getting on a motorway and driving from here to there. Same thing in the United States. I mean, you got an option. You can take Route 1 up the California coast, or you can take 101, or even if it's worse than that, Interstate 5. I
Yeah,
mean, there's nothing to see. It's just like you got hours of just going straight through.
yeah,
But if
concrete jungle. Yeah,
yeah, but here, I mean, if you're on the East Coast, you take the Lincoln Highway, or you take the old road to Oregon that leaves from Boston, Route 20, I think is what it is. I mean, they're you're never up to a high rate of speed, and there's lots to see
yeah. Well, and it's about riding and traveling. It's about the journey.
about the journey, and that was always, that was really that's the main attraction.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, did you notice? Well, let me ask you this: when did you move back to the U.S.?
72.
Okay, so did you notice a big difference between kind of European styles of riding or the motorcycle culture and the American riding scene?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you still in 72 pretty much had unlimited speed limits in Europe, and you came here and it was 65 do or die. Um, so, an unlimited speed doesn't mean that you're doing an unlimited speed, but it's nice to go at 80, 90, something like
Yeah.
that. That's comfortable. 65 is kind of slow by comparison.
Yeah, especially if you're used to being able to, or even just being able to go the speed that you want, and then being behind somebody who's going 65 exactly, and you can't really get past them. So,
It was
is
even worse because Nixon put in the 55 speed limit in 73.
right. Yeah, that had to have been kind of a bummer to come back and deal with that, at least from the speed perspective. Although in the Northeast, is it similar kind of riding that it is in parts of Europe, or is it still completely different?
Well, what would be similar would be the little roads, getting on the Lincoln
Hmm.
Highway or something like that. Those are like the old national roads. I mean, a highway's a highway, whether it's here or there. And
Hmm.
and now when you go over there, in Europe. I mean, they've got speed cameras and they send you tickets in the mail and then
Yeah.
so some of the limits are frustratingly ridiculous uh, on major highways. But here, it's the same old thing. As long as you're kind of smooth and you're not being evidently you know it's a
Right.
whole different thing.
Yeah,
So
if you're not being obvious about it. Yeah, my dad would tell me that you can drive or ride fast, but you have to do it smoothly so you don't look like you're going fast.
that's right.
That's always been in the back of my head. So,
Yeah.
let's go back to Europe for a second. When you went to Italy, you said you went to Italy on that trip. What was the motorcycle scene there? I mean, it had to be not just scooters everywhere, like you kind of see
Oh
in
yeah,
some of
no,
the
I mean,
movies.
well, it was like that, but
Sure.
there were huge number like in Rome
Hmm.
and in Milan. Venice, of course, has canals, so didn't have this so much. But when I was in Milan and I was in Rome and Florence, and they had Vespa taxis, so they were three wheelers.
Really?
Yeah, so and it was the whole deal. It was like an overgrown golf cart today, but it was a three wheeler, and they had a windshield. The guys would sit in the back, and it was all kind of open, and that was the taxi, right?
Wow.
So the whole that only worked in that climate. When the more northerly you went, the more of a real car you ended up with a taxi.
Makes
But
sense. Yeah.
the whole scene was different, and so they had a whole pile of these. I remember seeing these Moto Guzzi Falcones with the exterior flywheel,
Hmm.
and and, and I remarked on that at the time. It was like half the motors on the outside. You don't want to get your pant leg next to that. Um,
Yeah.
but so yeah, it was a whole different scene. The
Yeah.
Ducatis, of course, they in the middle '60s, the 350s and the 450 Ducatis, Desmos were coming out, and they were certainly very good performers. And
Hmm.
you had, I mean, the Italians. I mean, you had so many makers. I mean, Laverda, Benelli, MV, Ducati. I mean, and then the little bikes, Garelli, and just tons of names.
Yeah. And I mean, it sounds like, I mean, looking back on it, it sounds like you really got to experience a magical time in the motorcycle industry where it went from that kind of tinkering and figuring things out to really almost coming into its own right before, like you said, before the CBs and the UJM, the Universal Japanese Motorcycle started coming out. And, do you think that was kind of a special, kind of once in a lifetime time of the motorcycle industry?
Yes, I do. But I also think that it was a special time, in many many ways. We talked about Carnaby Street and Kings Road and
Right.
pirate radio, and I mean the whole thing from probably 1964 on. I mean, there was a huge change, and Kingman Brewster, who was the president of Yale, said the incoming class in 1963 or 64 was, crew-cutted, white-socked loafers, narrow lapels, narrow ties, shirts, blah
Right.
blah blah. And those same guys 2 years later had hair down their backs and had torn jeans, smoking dope, and locked them out of his office. So 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 you have to look at it in terms of the cultural context, that everything flipped upside down and changed. 64, 65 was a huge marker.
Hmm.
If you look at the early pictures of the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, they got ties and little suits on and velvet
The mop
trim on the
tops. Yeah.
lapels, and blah blah blah. Isn't this
Very
isn't
clean
this
cut.
lovely?
Yeah.
Next thing you know, it was Haight Ashbury in San Francisco and hippies and everything else.
Yeah.
And so that, in the context of that cultural shift, the motorbike industry fit right in.
Yeah. How did it change after that? Maybe in getting back, come to the US and then in the 70s and then the UJMs came out. What did you experience kind of the change then?
Well, the focus, I think, in the 70s was here in the United States when we started was still entirely common to find a store in a city. Here we had Cycle Parts of Boston, for example,
Mm-hmm.
but you also had East Coast Accessories and so on. And so these stores would only sell accessories. They didn't sell bikes themselves. And you could go in, you could get anything you wanted. 4-in-1 exhaust, winning performance, Kirker, um, and carb kits and shocks and anything you wanted. And so people would go there and buy stuff and upgrade their bikes, electronic ignitions, different tires, aluminum wheels. I mean, it just went on and on and on. Rear sets,
Mm-hmm.
um, extended front ends on the other side. Peanut tanks for choppers. So it was a really vibrant industry that was growing quickly, was could be seen everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, was part of that cultural shift, and I think that whole kind of store has really gone away. Um, then I, now then it became really a franchise dealer setup.
Mm-hmm.
But so all the way through, I would say that those stores were very successful, probably from 72 here in the States, maybe to 82 or 84,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And then it shifted again. So people would buy a UJM and then bring it to their little store there and say, I want to get Bogey Mulholland shocks,
Mm-hmm.
improve the handling. I want electronic ignition because everything was points and advanced units
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to improve the performance. So give me a K&N air filter and then let's go with a 4-into-1, so we can make more noise and then improve and then I need to rejet the carburetors and then
So it's
so
much more hands-on. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. You had mentioned in our last episode going to a motorcycle, I think it was a vintage motorcycle show in Ohio. And you mentioned seeing a lot of younger folks. So do you think that there is in the workings kind of a resurgence of that motorcycle culture from back in the day? Maybe not to the full extent, but maybe to some extent.
I think it's beginning. I think it's nascent. I think it's very hopeful, and I believe that that's what we're seeing. Um, but I believe there's so many uh, new bikes. Of course, everything's so much more money than it used to be. I mean,
Yeah.
but there are a terrific number of really fine used bikes out there, and I see these people um, buying a used bike and customizing it and making their own, and I think that's a great thing because number one, they're getting experience. Number two, they're interested in it and they're manifesting that by actually doing it, and number three, they're having fun.
Yeah.
So it's good, and that's what I do see, and I was surprised when I went to the Vintage Motorcycle Days, the AMA thing in Ohio. Um, I was surprised that how many young families were doing exactly that.
Yeah. Well, it's good to see.
Yeah, and there were very few, of the older brands. There were very few Harley Davidsons, very few. The European contingent was a couple of bikes on display from Royal Enfield. Of course, they're made in India, and
Mm-hmm.
some little booth for Triumph there, and so on. But it's the new wave, which was get an old bike, personalize it, make it yours, and figure it out, do the engineering, and they're making all manner of things, and I didn't notice that there was a resurgence for Peter Fonda's Harley Davidson from Easy Rider or anything like that, but it's kind of like road bike and touring bike and some adventure stuff,
Mm-hmm.
um, and if you have a Japanese motor from that's even 25 or 30 years old, they're relatively bulletproof. So,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I think it's good.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that maybe, you know, I think people are starting to look back and see how beautiful and well made, well designed, you know, those older bikes are from the 60s and 70s. And there's an allure in that, like that special time, even if it's just kind of ephemeral, but there's that spirit of that special time. And it's nice to hear that, you know, I think that's coming back and people are embracing that to a degree. So,
Yeah. I mean, and maybe the next step is they actually go somewhere, you know, do a tour, go camping, do something.
yeah.
Because you can have a hell of a lot of fun without necessarily spending tons and tons of money. You don't need a motel. You can go camping. You don't need, you know, there's the things you can do, and it's very good for the industry, for the sport.
Yeah, well, and if all you need to get to Venice is 50 cc's and a tent and a stove, I mean, you can do anything. So yeah, that too. So yeah, but I think just the last point is you don't necessarily need a big bike to do any kind of trips. You know, you can do bikes on a 50 cc motorcycle especially if you take the smaller roads. So
well, you could, and you can. Yeah, you're right. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Mike, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it and sharing kind of your own personal history of motorcycling. I was kind of captivated after we wrapped on the last one that I knew I had to record it. So I appreciate you sharing it with us.
All right, Mark. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Driven to Ride. Interact with us and check out full unedited conversations, photos, interviews, video interviews, plus other goodies on YouTube or Instagram at Driven to Ride Podcast. Or you can check us out at driventoridepodcast.com. And make sure you leave us a rating and review from wherever you get your podcasts, too. Do you have an idea for an episode or a guest, or you want to invite us out on an adventure? Email us, hello@driventoridepodcast.com. Driven to Ride is wholly owned by Flint Rock LLC, made possible with help from Matthew Miles, and written, hosted, and produced by me, Mark Long.